And it looks like the chat is active now. Okay. Oh, someone, Jacob is asking, I'm unable to ask questions direct to everyone. Is this a problem on my end? You probably have just, the default sometimes is private. So if you scroll up and you say everyone, then you can ask your question to everyone.
Mine's the exact same, and it only comes up with either you or Chris, not everyone.
Oh, okay. Okay, something the same? Okay. Okay, hold on. So while Chris starts to lecture, I'll try and fiddle with the settings at the back end.
Oh, very clever, Sabine.
Wrong.
Teamwork.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Fortunately, Sabina and I have worked together for about 10 years, so we know each other's strengths and weaknesses.
Yep.
Okay, so I should be able to share my screen, and I'm just going to go through the PowerPoints. I'll get that screen there. I'm just doing that. Share screen. That one. Can you see that now? Yep.
Yeah.
That good? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, all good.
Good. So essentially, what I'll start out with the learning outcomes. So part of what I will do in each session is come back to these learning outcomes, and the reason for that will become a little bit more evident today when we start to talk about constructive alignment. So really what you're wanting to do in any training session or of either skill or theoretical is to ensure that what you're doing, everything is commensurate with your learning outcomes. So these are the learning outcomes for the subject. So overall, we should be looking at those, one or two of those each week. So in this session, we're going to look at point 1, key concepts again of techniques of adult learning. 2, how this concept can be used. And then we're going to start to looking at number 4, for design and deliver training. And then a little bit of displaying competence and training micro skills. So there's quite a few of the learning outcomes that come into play in this session. I should just say, if you've got any questions or queries, or please let us know, or do a chat, or just interrupt me, or whatever, however you would like to. But I'm going to start with an activity. So from last week, which was Sabina's session, can you write down 3 things that you can recall from last week's class? And you could put those in chat, or you can put those on a piece. Yeah, put them in chat. Put them in chat. 3 things that you can recall.
I can still only message Sabine privately.
Yeah, chat's not available yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so at the moment I'm trying to find the settings and it's not helping me. So just put them in. I will get a transcript of these messages, and I'll read them out loud for Chris. So we're working with the technology.
That will be great.
So Emily says learning tools.
Yep. Good.
Samantha says LMS.
Good.
Online interactive tools and how to use them. Different platforms for online engagement. The Mentimeter app. The pros and cons in terms of engagement from these platforms. They've paid attention last week.
Yeah.
Using Socrative for exit polls, online tools to engage, Chloe says, very good. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you. So thinking the chances that we're going to get the chat working how we would like is small, unless we're all going out and in, so that's not worth it. So we'll roll with this, I think.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
And feel free to make a comment if you're confident, or just let us know, and we can do it verbally. Okay, so that's good. So I just wanted to make connections with last week. So prior to that, we were talking about design, and we were talking about principles of andragogy and the 10 universal principles in the session before that. And then last week we picked up on the session around online learning because of this new format that we're using, and that we want to maximize your opportunity to be able to use it prior to you giving your sessions in a couple of weeks' time. So yeah, this week going to module 1, I'd like to just talk briefly about a few different things. That each one of these areas that we're talking about could be a full lecture. The first one is about surface and deep learning. So I might just play it from this current slide. So it's the old iceberg. We use icebergs in organizational studies to talk about the visible and the invisible areas of organization. Remember, we talked about the invisible areas being culture and the top being the structure and of the organization. Well, here in surface and deep learning, we've got the iceberg again. And the iceberg here is surface and deep learning. So the surface stuff is around just memorizing facts, and the deeper level is understanding. And if you like, you could make the analogy between that a lot of surface stuff is in fact discussion about information. So in one of the previous lectures, we talked about the difference between data and information and knowledge. And we talked about the fact that knowledge is about the capacity to make distinctions or evaluations of worth in a particular area. So if we had a whole lot of information from the internet, that's not really knowledge. It's facts, and it's being able to disclose information about things, but it doesn't really mean that we know anything. We can just parrot back facts. If we have understanding, once we go to understanding, we have this capacity to make the distinctions. So we're growing in how to use that information to actually produce things, to do something. So knowing at a deeper level, here with this surface learning and deep learning, understanding relates to knowing at a deeper level. Now there was a lot of this came to light when there was in the internationalization of education in the 1980s and 90s. And there was a lot of debate in educational circles about the difference between Chinese learning, or learners from a Chinese background or a Confucian background, and countries that didn't use that Confucian background. And what was said was that typically in Confucian learning background areas, students were required to memorize things. So they learnt, the argument was that Chinese students learnt things by surface learning, which was memorization, in contrast to the ways that might be used in the West that required more than just a memorization. So there was a guy called John Biggs who really developed this idea of the contrast between surface and deep learning. And it was a big discussion in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s. It's not so much now, but it points to this sort of approach where in a surface approach, lots can be memorized, Whereas in a deeper approach, the connections between areas of knowledge and the distinctions are emphasized. I haven't been checking questions. Are there questions there? Any questions?
No, we're just happy that the chat's working.
Oh, it's working, is that?
Yes, public chat, all good.
Let me, I can't see it. Let me see, why can't I see it? What is it?
You got to click on it. That's why.
Yeah, chat.
Now I've got it.
Bubble.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So that was the important thing. That's the important thing in this slide, that there is that a surface learning emphasizes memorization. So if you wanted to learn a times table, or if you wanted to learn the names of words, necessarily you have to remember them. But then once you've remembered them, in order to use them, then you need to make connections between those individual pieces of information and what it is that you actually want to do. So if we were designing some learning and we just wanted people to remember things, you could perhaps use a surface approach. That would be okay. If you wanted for people to learn a glossary of terms, that's okay. But then if you wanted them to actually have a discussion using those terms, you would need to start to go to a deep approach and get people to understand how it is that those terms relate to other terms and how they connect to existing concepts. Yeah, is that sort of clear? So a surface approach is not necessarily bad, it just depends on the context. And the richer the material, the more tricky it is to use a deep approach.
So is it like, you know, police learning the phonetic alphabet? You know, you don't really have to know what it means, but obviously it's just useful to know it all the way through when you're communicating to other people. But then you could always, if you wanted to discuss the history of the phonetic alphabet, you could always go down and research and then discuss it with other people for a deeper level of understanding.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
So a surface approach is that you don't necessarily have to know all of that deeper stuff that you're talking about, but you can at least sort of know it. You know what it means. So I would have a very surface approach to technology. Yeah. Sabina would have a much deeper approach. I look at it and my eyes glaze over. And I think, oh yeah, I think I know what that means. And then I go to do something and realize I can't do it. Yeah. So my understanding is, I think I know what it means. It's very surfacey. But Sabina would have made lots of connections. Yeah. Whereas if we're looking at content of this lecture, I sort of tend to know I know a lot of the connections. I don't just know the language. Yeah. Okay, so that's just that's important because you don't want to necessarily overwhelm people with deep approaches if it's not necessary, and vice versa. If you need to be doing a training session that requires people to know the reasons for what you're doing things, then you will need to adopt more of a deep approach. Yeah? Seeing a few head nods, that's good. Okay, so if I go to our next slide, what about this? How can we design a teaching session to promote deep learning? What would you think? How would we design a teaching session to promote deep learning? Have a think about that, and maybe you could respond with some chat comments now that I can see them.
Would you make the session be about them having to teach you the information?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good. So if you made it practical and got people to teach you and to explain it to you, that would do it, because that would use a number of things. That would make them do a number of things. Good one. Others?
Private message. You would outline the learning objectives.
Yep, that would be a good way to start. Outline the learning objectives, and then how would it differ? How would it differ if you were designing a surface learning? What things would make it deep rather than surface.
Highlighting the things that they need to memorize.
Yep, you could highlight the things they need to memorize. Then what?
Get them to give you an example from their own experience.
That's good. So you bring in experience. Bring in experience is a good one. Yeah. Let me show you what I've put in the slides. So first one is ask critical questions. So do ask them questions. If you were doing wanted them to know deep, you could ask them, why is it that you're doing that? How do you do that, a particular thing? So those could be in your learning outcomes. As you said, we could use those in the learning outcomes. But if you ask critical questions, it means that they can't just parrot back to you the meaning of it. So it's not what does it mean, it's the question would be not what does it mean, but how do you do something? Yeah. 2, design activities, move this out of the row, to help students make connections between concepts. So one of the things that good teachers do is to make connections with other areas that are of relevance to their learners. So it might be that you say, remember when in a previous class we looked at this, or you would remember this from either your experience or background. So whoever said going back to experience is a good one. And 3, assess understanding of concepts rather than, what does that say? Move that. Rather than rote learning. Okay, so assessing understanding rather than rote learning. And here again, that's the difference between on the level of questioning. Now, soon we'll look at Bloom's taxonomy, which talks about different levels of learning and how you would develop questions to do that. What sort of words you would need to use to ask a question that tested concepts rather than rote learning. Okay. So here's Bloom's taxonomy, and you will see that in Bloom's who's heard of Bloom's taxonomy before? Anybody? Anybody? No. Okay. So Bloom's taxonomy is this. It's a taxonomy that's a list. It's a category, a bunch of categories that were developed by a guy called Bloom a long time ago. And what he basically did was to develop a whole lot of verbs. So if you look on these words, they're all verbs: recognizing, recalling, interpreting, executing, differentiating, checking, generating, planning. They're all things that you do. And what they said was that there are different levels of them. So if you like, this is a continuum from a very basic level over at this. Can you see my arrow? You can see that?
We're seeing the arrow, but there's a web link. That's all we're seeing.
A web link.
Yeah.
You're not seeing this. You're not seeing my PowerPoint.
Yeah, I was seeing the Bloom's text, like the heading, but underneath it has the web link, but nothing else. So I see your cursor going around as if you're pointing to things, but I'm just seeing a web link.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's not good. Okay.
That's because you're still presenting the PowerPoint. If you escape out of that, it should just capture your screen.
Okay, let's do that. Has that got it now? No?
Try and escape.
Yes. Yeah, it's good. It's when I escape. Oh, hang on, come out of that. Yeah.
There you go. That's work.
Now, can you see this though? I don't think you'll be able to see it. Let me see. It's probably in that one. Can you see that?
At the moment, we're still on your PowerPoint slides, not
Okay.
on the website.
Okay. I don't think it's. Let me see. How would I share that, Sabine?
So you can either go to the website by clicking on the hyperlink, or what I might do is just quickly put a file up with Bloom's taxonomy. I'll
Okay.
quickly grab one.
Yep. So essentially what it is a continuum of where learning is categorized on its depth according to the questions that are asked. So on one end of on one end is really superficial things where people are asked to remember something, and then it gradually gets deeper from remembering to understanding, to applying, to analyzing, to evaluating, and to creating or synthesizing knowledge. So a surface approach might be, you might need to recognize or identify something, or just recall something. So it would be as simple as remembering a piece of information. Yeah, and that would give you you could ask a question, and it might be the question from a surface perspective under remember might be, can you identify? Can you recall? Yeah. So with what I tend to do in my questioning of at the beginning of lectures, I will start off with a remember question. So I will talk about, what can you remember from last week? Yeah. And it's not, can you evaluate, which is a much deeper level. It's, what can you remember? And maybe, do you understand? How are you going, Sabine?
Sorry, it's through the chat box, so people should have a JPEG little file of the Bloom's taxonomy.
Okay, so if we click on that, we get that?
Yes, thank you. Okay, some people have got that. Yeah.
Okay, so can you see that on my screen?
Nope.
Okay.
Are you on the PowerPoint for your screen, or is it on the website for your screen?
It's on the website.
Oh.
Change your screens. So do you have a MacBook, or are you on your laptop or a computer?
A MacBook.
Okay, put three fingers on your notepad and lift it up, and it should come to like all your browsers that are open, and you can click on the website one, and that it should take us to it.
No, it's not doing
Okay, Chris, what I think's happened is you've shared screen, but you've specifically chosen the PowerPoint application to share, not your screen. So if you stop sharing and then share again, but using the option to share your screen rather than the application, it should cover whatever you're looking at.
Okay, let me get back to that. I've got lots of screens open now.
And this is good for you guys to see as well, because if you're presenting, you have to make that decision. Am I going to just stick to PowerPoint, or am I going to show all my windows?
And to be honest, this is a good exercise. I've done an online training with a guy, and he was polite and didn't let me know that he wasn't seeing anything. So we got to the end, and then he told me, and I was like, "You're kidding me."
Yeah,
exactly. At least you're asking the question, can you see this? So it gives an opportunity.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you see that?
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. So what we've got on this, to make it a bit bigger, we've got these different categories, and they've actually done it differently to the one that I was linked in the PowerPoint slide. So they've got remember at the bottom as the lowest level, and they've got here recall facts and basic concepts. Yeah. So if you wanted to have in developing a training session, you might start off with that level of learning outcome initially. So I often say that I really dislike multiple choice questions in final exams, because they only test recall facts and basic concept usually, unless you're very clever at writing multiple choice questions. They'll be remembering facts. But in fact, at the end of a subject in an exam, you're actually wanting to be evaluating. I'm wanting to know at the end of a subject, I'm wanting to know if you can draw connections amongst ideas and if you can identify a stand or a decision, not whether you can tell me what the concepts mean. Yeah. So people say, about having multiple choices in exam. I think it's a bad medium to be using in exams unless you are very clever at writing questions that can evaluate and analyze, and that's very hard to do in multiple choice. Yeah. So you start off, if your learning outcome is to remember things and have a basic understanding, they will use a different verb. You won't be, when you come up to the verbs for drawing connections would be compare or discuss the differences, or question, or they're asking you to do different things as per apply or understand. So what happens to create depth is that the questions require more distinction making. Somebody's just asked a question, I think.
No, just put the official link in.
Oh, okay, good. So is that sort of clear? Bloom's taxonomy is really useful if you want to find verbs to develop learning outcomes. I still go back to it. If I get stuck in writing a learning outcome, I can still go back to Bloom's taxonomy to look up the verbs that I might be able to use.
Chris?
Yeah.
I opened up a document. It's very blurry. You can't see the writing on the words are next to say create and evaluate, like the little.
Yeah, maybe find another one, Michael. If that's really blurry, you'll find lots of them. If you look up Bloom's taxonomy if you Google it, you'll find that there's lots of versions of it. So find one that you can read. They'll all be similar. So just get on your browser and look one up would be my suggestion. Okay, so now you should be able to see me again. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Let's go back to that, share screen again. And we'll go back to this one. Okay. Oh, that's last week's lecture, sorry. So share screen, and we want this one.
Sounds like someone needs to feed the dog.
Yes. Neighbors. Okay. So in terms of the learning styles, Kolb did this. So a second thing in terms of the developing and designing learning approaches, it's important to understand that people learn in different ways, and that there are different learning styles. Now, Kolb did a lot of work on this in his work on a learning styles inventory, and he had a number of different levels that he developed so that people could map their learning styles. Now, if you wanted to do this, you can develop this. I'm not sure that we'll do it right now, but you can go across each line and rate the word that best describes the way you learn as 4. If you go across here and then did all of those through there, then you would come up with a weighting that you can weight onto this grid to determine whether your learning style is predominantly based on you learn a lot by having concrete experience, or whether you learn a lot by reflective observation, or abstract conceptualization, or active experimentation. So depending on your score on each of those, it will bring up your learning style. As I said, we won't do that right now, but you might want to do it in your do it at home and check it out and see what your learning style is. So Kolb stuff is quite old. You can see it's 1984. His work has endured, so that tells you that there's quality in it. And if you notice, it's similar to the Kurt Lewin's action research cycle. So again, you've got this spiral on doing something, then what happened, evaluating what's happened, then doing, and then evaluating and saying, now what will the next steps be, which is very similar to Kurt Lewin's action research or action learning spiral. So I just thought it was useful to put Kolb in there, where it's emphasizing for adults on doing something. So it's emphasizing people using experience. There it is, the learning cycle, which has been, it's still used, it's still a very common model that's often adopted in organizations in some way or shape. Any questions on that? Comments? No? Okay. The implications, different people learn in different ways. Different people have different learning preferences. So you will find that will come out that people will express their learning in ways that might be quite different to how you do. And it's important that we value different learners' experiences. So one way to do that is to mix up the modes that you're using in your learning. So you might want to have something that's really visual, something that's quite practical. So a video would appeal to some people, and people would learn. If you're a visual learner, then using a video might be really useful. For others, it might be talk to somebody, discuss something. For others, it might be for them to write notes. So if you try and remember that when you're doing a training session to mix things up, it's quite useful. Okay, so this section's really about, this module's on about constructive alignment. Who's heard of the term constructive alignment before? Anybody? Anybody? Okay. It's used.
Of yes, no, head shakes.
Head shakes. Okay.
Yes, no.
Okay. I may have used the term in the class up until this point. It comes from a guy called John Biggs. Was one of the first, if not the first, to use the term, and then Delahaye and Choi have picked it up. Constructive alignment is ensuring that the learning outcomes seen here are coherently attached to the design and delivery of the training. So you want to make sure that what it is that students or trainees are required to learn is clearly delineated in the learning outcomes, and then that the delivery of the training is aligned to that, and any assessment is aligned to that. So what's actually being assessed are the learning outcomes, and what is actually being delivered are information that help trainees to achieve the learning outcomes. Now you will find in the course of your studies at university, I have no doubt that you will have subjects where there is the assessments and the learning is not well aligned. And in fact, I can give you a good example from my own experience. Those that did Management 311 last semester would remember that at the beginning of lecture 1, and again maybe at the end in lecture 13, I talked about that one of the learning outcomes in that subject was for students to be able to do a comprehensive discussion or assessment of the change management literature. That was a learning outcome, yeah? But within the subject, whoever designed it didn't talk to that much, so there wasn't a great deal of discussion in the content or in any of the assessments was that assessed. So that learning outcome was not assessed. So what I did at the beginning of that subject was to apologize and say, look, I'm sorry, this learning outcome is here. It actually doesn't align with the rest of the subject. So I'm actually not going to talk, not even going to use it. I'm just going to do the others. So, and I've since gone back to our discipline leaders and the associate dean and said that we need to change that learning outcome because it's not constructively aligned. So when you're doing your training session, what you need to think about is, what do you want your students or your trainees to be able to do at the end of the session? That's where you start. That's where you start. And then once you've done that, then you can look at how you are going to teach that so that they can do those. And then you want to know, how are you going to evaluate or assess whether that has actually been achieved? And they should line up. Now, it's important within the delivery of the training and the design of the training that you work with the trainees from where they're at. So you scaffold it and gradually develop sections that build on one another. So remember we talked about chunking the learning. So you chunk sections next to one another with an increasing degree of difficulty. Yeah. And then at the end, you need to have some way of evaluating whether the participants can actually achieve those learning outcomes. Again, learning characteristics come into play. You might need to use different things. You might need to, if it's as we will see, if it's a skill session, you need to show and tell. And for some, that might mean that you've got to show in different ways and tell in different ways, in fact. Okay, I'm doing lots of talking. Are there any questions about that? No questions. That's all fairly clear. So have you developed the learning outcomes for your training session? Has anybody got that far? No? Yes? Yes, I've got a few yeses. So that's once you've decided what it is that you want to do, the next step might be, what are the learning outcomes? What do you want people to be able to do? How many are recommended? So it depends on the session. So Amanda, for this session, I would think that something like 3 would be plenty. Sabina, would you agree?
Yeah, because it's short, and even I work on a lot of different subjects. We basically say not more than 5 for the whole subject. It becomes too much.
Yeah. I think in that subject that I criticised, Management 311, I think there are only 3, which is too few for a subject. I would think that you need about 5 for a subject, but for your training sessions, I think 3 is plenty. Yeah. So then the next question would be, so Jasmine is saying, if we're not doing a skill session, that is a theory session, how would you recommend we evaluate? Okay, so it would be, does anybody want to help? Anybody have any ideas before I respond? How would you evaluate a theory session?
Get them to explain it back to you based on an experience that they've had, link it to some kind of example that they can demonstrate, I guess.
Okay, so get them to talk about, you could get them to respond somehow how they link it, but to their experience. Somebody else is saying quiz. Somebody else would be to have a sense check. Oh, that's Jasmine, you're saying that. A sense check would be good, yeah. Okay, or a role play or demonstration. So, yeah, or if it's just a theory, if you just want for people to understand theoretically, you can use the sorts of things that are used in your exams here at uni. You could get people to write 20 words, write 20 words about a concept, or you could have a quiz or a crossword. Some people have used crosswords so that they can talk about, and you give the clue with a concept, with the description of a concept, and they have to provide the word, or vice versa. You could have, sorry, there's a second conversation going on. I'm just continuing to look at this question about assessing or evaluating theory sessions. So if you wanted to, for your level of training, you could ask them what are the key points, or list the key points. You could have 6 points that are jumbled that might be important, and say what are the most important, or how would you prioritize the most important. You could have meanings, matching meanings with words, something like that. That would be fine. Remember, you're not going to have time to do high-level analysis in your theory session. It will largely be on Bloom's taxonomy. It's going to be the lower level ones. It's going to be about recall and remembering or applying. It's not going to be about analysis. Is that helpful, Jasmine? Cool, good. Now there's another question from Amber about presentation for first tutorial. So I'm going to leave that till later. We'll talk about that stuff a little later. At this point in time, I'd like to stay on the constructive alignment stuff. So we'll come back to that later if that's okay. Okay, thanks, Amber. So yeah, if in the sequence of what you need to do in developing your training session, constructive alignment first. Make sure that you have your learning outcomes, and then what you teach and what you assess are all aligned. So here's another diagram that shows the relationship between learning outcomes and assessment and learning strategy. That all needs to be together. It all needs to be, and you'll do your learning outcomes and do assessment, then you do strategy, and you might cycle around that a few times. Designing the learning outcomes to match the learning experience to match the learning outcomes is important. Yeah. So that's important as well. And then there's this is what not to do. Don't have 8 fairly dense learning objectives for your little session. The learning objectives, if you ever see a class or a subject or something with that many objectives looking like that, you could say that that's too crowded. You could critique that to death. Yeah. You see the verbs are interesting too. List, describe, understand, identify. So that's a fairly surfacey list, set of objectives. Yeah, there's not much analysis and create in those. Okay. So now getting to the skill session. So looking more specifically, if you are doing a skill session, there are a few principles according to your textbook that they recommend. So this is coming from there, and they talk about having learning objectives for skill sessions, and they have what they call a terminal behavior statement. They have standards and they have conditions. So here's a good example. So just read this and think about it, what's in it. So the example is to repair a puncture in a bicycle tube in 10 minutes in daylight conditions using the repair kit provided. Okay, can you see how there are standards and conditions in there? What's the standard?
10 minutes and in daylight.
That's it.
Oh no, sorry, 10 minutes.
Yeah. So it's the standard is to repair the puncture in 10 minutes in daylight conditions. Oh well, daylight conditions is daylight conditions. I guess. Yeah. So it's specific. It's quite clear. So if you're doing a skill session, you would need to have something like that, a terminal behavior statement. So it might be that you say you want somebody to be able to tie a particular type of knot, you know, in certain conditions in a certain time. Yeah. So it narrows it, it prescribes it a little bit more. Okay. So a specific purpose statement is a specific purpose statement has a subject, what's your topic, an outcome, what's your point, and a so what, who cares. What's your topic for your purpose statement, what's the outcome or the point of it, and so what. So you need to have a specific purpose statement that links to your training session. Okay, here's an example. Here's something that you can practice on. A skill session on shoulder stretch exercises. Subject, outcome, so what. See if you can write that down.
Can you just repeat that? I was just taking some notes and missed it.
Can you see the screen? A specific purpose statement on a skill session on shoulder stretches. So there should be a subject, an outcome, and a so what. How are we going? Any thoughts? How would it look? What would you have?
I don't know if I'm right, but I'm just going to.
Yeah, good.
That the subject would be how to stretch your shoulder, and the outcome would be to learn how to stretch it effectively. And the reason why you're doing it is because muscle tension leads to pain, so stretching minimizes pain. Okay, so go through that again. The subject was what? How the subject is how to stretch your shoulder, how to stretch a muscle. And the outcome would be how to perform this stretch like effectively and safely. And then why, or like the so what would be, you know, if you have muscle tension in your shoulder, it can lead to pain or worse things. So therefore stretching it out would minimize the chance of that happening. Minimize. Yeah, good. Okay, so I think your subject is good. I think some of your outcome is part of your subject as well. Okay.
So
Yeah.
wouldn't the outcome, would an outcome be a well-stretched muscle?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah.
And the implications of that would be then what you said. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now James has put in chat, subject would be exercise, the outcome would be improved physical condition. Yeah. Or the outcome might be a stretched muscle, and the so what might be the improved physical condition. Yeah. So you would play with those until it's sharp. So you could just get your session, look at it, what it is that you want people to be able to do is the key, and that becomes your subject. Then what is the outcome of what they will do, and then what are the implications of what it is that they can do. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the first two sessions, the face-to-face sessions, was the importance of the so what. Is really the so what is, it needs to be something that matters to people. So you need to get people's attention and experience. Why would they want to learn what it is that you want to teach them? So you somehow need to make that relevant. Yeah. So the subject needs to be well phrased. The outcome needs to be clear and measurable. But the so what is what grabs them in the first place. Okay. Good. So I will keep moving. So in the skill session is about teaching procedure. And there's usually a logical order of the process that's crucial. And a textbook talks about this approach of showing, and then telling, then checking for understanding, and then practice. And it goes along like this, that there's an introduction where you introduce what it is that you're going to do, and you gain people's interest and tell them why it's important for them to learn this particular skill. And then you do show, tell, check, practice. Yeah. And then you might do it again. You might do it as a part B. So you've done part A, and then you do part B with same procedure, showing and telling, etc. And then you come to a conclusion. Now, remember, in your introduction, you need to have your SPS, and that's the key for what you do. So in the structure of a skill session, doesn't matter what it is, we're recommending that you use this model. Is that clear? Questions? Comments?
Can you refresh our memory what SPS stands for?
Specific purpose statement. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's like a learning outcome. It's like a statement. Yeah. Repair a puncture in a bicycle tube in 10 minutes in daylight conditions using the repair kit provided. Yeah. So is that helpful?
Yeah.
That should give you a nice structure for your training session if you're doing a skill session. Comments, questions? Everybody's good? Okay, I'll move on to the next one, which is the theory session. Thanks for your comments. People are saying it's good, it's helpful. Yes, that helps a lot. It should be, I think it should make it a lot easier. So the theory session only has three steps: explanation, activity, and summary. So you will find that in lecturing, that good lecturers will do that. Lecturers will have, in their theory sessions, will have an explanation, then they'll have an activity of some description. So it might be talk to somebody or discuss this or a problem or something, and then they'll summarize the points and chunk it. So you'll notice in my session here, I've chunked it into those modules so that I'm using chunks. So that in each of those, there should be some form of EAS in each of them. And it might just be, the activity might be just questions. It could be something where you ask people to do something more than questions. But if you have that, and then you do the explanation activity, and then at the end you reiterate the points. I'll do that at the end of the whole session, is to summarize the modules and the chunks that you've been through. It just helps retention. Okay, so there's the structure of the theory session. You have your introduction. Remember your so what. Again, in the introduction, you want to get people to buy in because it's important to them. So all the time in this course, I try to relate it, try to do the introduction to the lectures as to why it's important. In this particular session, this is important because it's directly going to help you how to do your presentation. That's point one. But point two, it will help you to be able to do any skill or theory session in the future. So again, there it is. It's explanation, activity, and summary. And then conclusion. Now, there's a question from Sarah. Is the activity something that only the learner does? You can do it yourself as a presenter if you want to, but it's primarily to get for the learners. Yeah, it's primarily for the learners, but you can participate in some way if you would like to as a presenter. Okay. Any other questions or comments? For those that are doing a theory session, is that helpful? Are any of you doing theory sessions? Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Rebecca is. Elizabeth, yeah. Yeah, good. Thanks, Amber. Good, Ebony. Okay, so two structures: structure for a skill session, structure for a theory session. It's not rocket science. It's a fairly simple model, but it is a very effective model, and it does draw on those principles of andragogy about chunking and about getting people to buy in the initial. So that's a theory session, an example of an SPS. The subject is a traveler's guide to Dubai. The objective are 3 interesting facts about the people and culture of Dubai. So what? So that you'll be better informed on the Gulf region, able to impress an employer or stop off en route to Europe or whatever. Okay. So that's a specific purpose statement for a traveler's guide to Dubai. And then you would have, of course, have your learning outcomes in there as well. Any questions on that? Okay, then I will move on to Sabina's going to do this next session, this next module rather, on online and blended and flipped.
Yes, thank you. Sabina, turns out, can't count because we were in module 5 and now we're in module 7. So we skipped 1. I am going to basically distract you guys because I'll get some slides up for myself that Chris doesn't have to press them for me. And while I do that, I'm going to launch a quick poll on what you guys are doing, theory or skill session, or what you're thinking about at the moment. So if it's all working all right, look at that, it is working all right. So now, Chris and I will swap from...
Yep, fine.
So can you stop sharing, Chris?
I certainly can.
Thank you. Okay, so now I should have...
Oh, that's interesting. 50%, is that right? 50% are doing theory and 50% are doing skill, really?
Oh,
No.
still going. We've got 81 of the votes. There's a few people not voting, including you and me, Chris. But
Okay.
well, at the moment, it's 50-50.
It's 50-50. That's extraordinary. That's about 54 to 46.
Okay.
Wow. That's very close. Interesting. How big is the sample size? The sample size is 25.
Yeah, because we don't count. So I can end the polling.
Yeah.
And I'm going to share the results. There you go. And then I'm going to get my screen correct. How big is the sample size? Oh, Elizabeth's asking how big is the sample size. Very clever. some statistician with us. So basically at the moment, the majority of you guys say skill and a few theory. So do you already know topics? No, that's okay. Yeah, they can both be really interesting, theory and skill. And yeah, picked up on Elizabeth doing stats, sample size. Can you guys see anything of my screen? Because I'm pressing so many buttons that... Okay, yeah, I am sharing something. It's just not my slides, I think.
Yeah, it's just we're still seeing the SOS from...
cool. Okay, yeah. So we've established, so now you can see module 7?
Yep, module 7, yep.
Perfect. We've established last week for all the IT prowess, I cannot share my screen properly. Okay, let's see how we go. I'm going to see if I can just flick it open. Yeah. Is that working for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So my topic is a little bit about online, blended and flipped. So do we know all those terms for starters? No, a few people shaking your head. Okay, well, this is a guess, but I'm assuming most of us know online. So I don't know what flipped is. Okay, good. Good. Unsure what is meant by flipped. Okay, cool. Yeah. Now, Chris, you can chime in here because I know it from a practice base, but I know you've done a bit of, at least a little bit of background reading on flipped classroom. So tell me if I'm going off topic. So basically, online is 100% online learning. That is not what we're doing at the moment. We have a variety of live sessions, some material online, and we basically mesh it all together. Yeah. So some courses do basically from day dot, it's only going to be online. So some courses I've been working on in my main job is engineering, which has been a very face-to-face space, but they need industry experts. So they need people working in industry to come in for a couple of days, like a few workshops, and then another kind of guest lecturer comes in, and they do that for a couple of times during the semester. So that type of subject lends itself really well to become a fully online subject, because they can pre-tape some of the material, they can write the material, and then you don't have to book. Now, in this case, it's completely impossible, but last year they had to book engineers across the country to actually come and deliver a lecture. So you know, online speaks for itself. Now, let's talk about flipped. So flipped is the material that I have read was, and I don't know if that's 100% correct, but somehow it originated in high schools, that some of the science teachers basically said, rather than explain everything that students need to know and need to do before they get to class, I want them to already have material and know what I want them to do before they arrive in class. So what they did is they actually, and that's Flipped has started with the, I guess, higher level of accessibility of online teaching. So once YouTube became you know, a more mainstream thing. These were not lecturers, they were high school teachers. They taped themselves and they said, well, you know, you need to know, I don't know anything about science, but you need to know a few things that you require. You need to know the equipment and what experiment we're going to do. So students were basically, I've mentioned it last week, front-loaded. And you see that as soon as you start to go online, a lot of things are sometimes front-loaded. So they would get an idea of what is expected of them, what will be covered before the lecture, then they lecture or the face-to-face class. Then they would actually do a lot of activities. And sometimes they do have a little bit of reflection, or they just rest up. So the idea was that it's very active, and it's very active in the class. And instead of having homework after, it's maybe a little bit of reflection, but it's most of the stuff is in front. That's why I call it flipped. Do you want to chime in on that, Chris? Are you happy?
So with that, does that just mean, like, an example would be for medical subjects, it's the pre-lab, then they go to their lab work, and then they have a post-lab?
Yes, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, so that actually, well, if you go pre-lab, post, so it's kind of, I would actually have to look at it to see whether it's flipped or blended, or maybe, you know, so you can start the definitions and then you see that some things become really blurry, but definitely an example. Yeah, so they do it with labs because they want students, they don't want to waste time the first 1 or 2 tutorials saying, this is the lab, look at this, look at that, this is dangerous. So that's why they sometimes flip material and expect students to already know how the lab works before they even enter. Makes sense? Yeah, okay. Have I lost people, or are we okay with flipped?
Yeah, it's good. That was good.
Okay, now blended is something that you can basically, there's so many different forms of blended, and I have one of my colleagues as a tell, and he says everything at university, even though things that lecturers and students are very passionate about is a face-to-face course, he says everything's blended. And the reason for him making that statement is that every subject across the uni has a Moodle site, and therefore it's partly online.
Yep, I agree with that.
Yeah, and to what extent you're basically you're making it blended, or you lean more towards the online or more towards the face-to-face. That's up to the individual teaching, but for basically every subject across uni, there is some level of blended. So basically, in terms of my slides, yeah. Okay, so this terminology is used very often, online, blended, flipped. And for you, when now you're presenting in an online environment, this
lost you, Sabine.
So I could hear someone talk. That's okay. Just wave to me or put in the chat. No sounds.
It's coming and going.
We just missed you.
For that whole slide.
Okay.
To the start of that slide, rather.
I'm going to. Okay, see how we go. Otherwise, I'm going to put my camera off just to increase the bandwidth. Yeah, so we'll see. Okay, so so this terminology, online, blended, and flipped, you'll come across as soon as you are starting to teach online. And if we were still teaching this subject as we did last year, you wouldn't be exposed to this that much. But even in your own sessions, you kind of have to think about, am I actually going to flip some of my material? So last week, what I was saying is that if you want to show a YouTube clip or you want students to be prepared for your session, like I think I used the example of fold a towel in the shape of a dog. You need to basically flip content and say, you need to come prepared with a towel before we actually have the session. And if you want them to see a YouTube clip, you flip that and you basically tell your trainees that yeah, they need to know this or they need to be prepared. If you are doing this face-to-face, you would basically not have to tell anything to students, and you just say, here, I've got 20 towels and we're gonna look at a video about how to make the towel into a shape, and that's it. So it becomes, I think it's really interesting. It becomes a puzzle. As soon as you go online, it's like, how are we going to do this, and what's better at which stage? And what I think Michelle was just saying, sometimes pre-live and post sessions is useful, whether it's a blended or an online approach. Yeah. Just a question, do you guys, now I've basically talked a little bit about this, do you guys see this in your subjects now? Yeah. Okay. I've got one head shake. Good. It'll be interesting to actually see what your subjects were before COVID and now, and see if some are using that. I don't think any. Well, you could debate whether it's online because they haven't been designed as online courses, but see if they do blended and flipped. So Matthew was saying, oh, I've got last year's lectures. One could argue that's fully online. Is that best way of teaching? Probably not. And it's still a little bit of a blend because the mindset is still face-to-face, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so have a think about how about this stuff and how you're going to use it in your material. In your training session. And I have some resources. I'll have a chat with Chris about whether I'll pass those resources along, because when we were doing some training for academics that have only taught face-to-face, we actually gave them a little handout on the flipped classroom because it's not super well known. Oh, so Michelle was saying I have one subject that went full online due to COVID. Interesting. Successfully or
I don't think it is, just because I think that they pretty much slacked off. The amount of content I would have been learning is dropped significantly compared to if I was actually going to class or if they did like a live class.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating because and the thing is, like for most people, it's really, and this is any teacher across the board, pretty much around the globe. You know, it's a skill set to teach online. It's a skill set to teach in class, and they have to learn it overnight. But yeah, and then using terminology, it's interesting. Yeah, yeah. If you do online from the start, you can make it really rich. Like you can add links and interactivity and all that stuff. So it's good. Okay, so next slide that I've got up is there's something else, and this is what you'll find if it's fully online, and even what Michelle was saying or what Matthew was saying, I don't think that's happening at the moment. So there's basically, once it's fully online, there's technology enhanced learning. Now, we do not expect you to do that at all in your face-to-face, you know, in your face-to-face Zoom things, because you wouldn't have the time and the resources for it. But I'm just going to highlight these things for you. So we've got something that's called H5P, and I'll see if I can jump on that, or I'll give you the link. And that's basically interactivity. So you would do, so what I showed you last week was live interactivity. You can also do interactivity that you've set up beforehand. So we worked on a subject, biofabrication, is really, really out there. But people needed to know how some parts of testing biomaterial worked. So what we did is like we had a picture of a thing in the lab, and it was a fully online course, and they can't go in there and understand exactly how some parts of the lab work, but we wanted them to understand the components. So we had like little drag and drop activities, so they could actually place the word where it fit. So that's something like H5P. You can match things. It's quite interesting, but it has to be thought out beforehand. Now, another thing, and I think this is very interesting as well with VR, virtual reality. Has anyone done virtual reality? No? Well, Michelle is head of the class. She's experienced everything. Can you enlighten us, Michelle?
As in like worked with it, or just like done it as in like I've experienced like I've done like a maze, like a haunted house kind of thing through it.
Okay, so anything to do with study or just a fun thing?
Just a fun thing.
Okay, cool. That's actually, that helps me because I actually study a lot as well, and some is fully online, some is a little bit face-to-face, but one of the courses I've done was really selling itself as VR. This is going to be the best thing because, you know, it's a Cert 4 or diploma in VR. So lo and behold, I get the machine, and it took me a good solid week to figure out how the stupid machine worked. And then I had to be at a certain time in the meeting room, wear the goggles, and be in a virtual space. And it was at the Facebook headquarters. So the first time you sit there, it's really cool because you can do like a few loops. But then you think about the benefit for a learner, and it was basically nothing because then the lecturer started to talk as would be in a live session. So I actually think something like this is more beneficial because you can actually see us, you can see our gestures, whereas in the virtual reality, all I could see was like a blue person. But what Michelle is basically saying with the haunted house, it's really hard to actually have that experience, or in terms of education, work health and safety, it's really hard to get certain experiences unless you go VR. So it has a place. Yeah. Do you guys want to have a look at H5P, or are we good to move on? I'm getting nothing. Good to move on. Okay, what I'll do is like I'll show you guys in some material afterwards so you can have a look. Yeah. Okay. Feedback. So we had a few questions about the assessment, which Chris and I will talk about after this, I think. But giving feedback and how that will work in this particular subject. So, so I put it on, you know, dot points and how that links to your assessment. So it is a skill in and of itself, and basically you tend to give feedback to anyone that's teaching. In your mind already, you go, this is good, this is not so good. If I were giving the same training, I would do it a different way. We're actually trying to capture that, align it with some theory, which Chris will enlighten you on, and then link it to your training sessions. So in terms of how this works in this subject, you will get the content in terms of the theory of feedback from Chris. Then you will start to get your first training sessions in week 7. And we are asking you to provide a draft feedback form. And last year it wasn't prescriptive. It's not like there's one way to do feedback. It was quite open, but there were some key things that were important in terms of giving someone feedback. So you basically make a little document, you send that through to us, and based on that document, I'll make sure it's anonymized. I'll make a module on feedback, which is essentially, it's kind of flipped, but flip with some live interaction as well, because you're getting the content and the information in live environment, in book environment. And then once we looked at your information in terms of the draft feedback, we make the module, we give you some pointers, and then on the end of semester, you submit the final piece for assessment 3, and that is your feedback on one of your peers. Yeah. And so it's basically, we've given you draft, example, final submission, and then that becomes your assessment 3. Is that clear for people?
What was that? What was that previously?
What was that previous? That's a really good question, actually. So previously, you would basically be in the room. One of your peers would do the assessment, and you would scribble. Some did it every week, some did it most weeks. So you would basically make a feedback form and hand that to us. And get feedback. You would, from us, you would get feedback on your feedback, which is a page, yeah? And on the end of semester, you would get a mark for how you have actually given your peers feedback, yeah? But now we basically have to swap it to a more streamlined online approach. So this is the idea. I'm a very visual learner, so I'm waving my hands, but I'll make sure that it's very clear. Mitch is laughing. It's very clear in the communication of how it will work. The idea is you have to be able to give feedback to your peers, whether it's in class or on a Zoom, and that's one of the assessments.
So Michelle has asked, will there be a revised subject outline put up onto Moodle with all this outlined? The answer is yes, Michelle. We're actually in the process of doing that. We have, because it means that we have to revise the exam for the subject, I have to get that approved by the head of discipline. And so we have put in a suggestion for how we want to revise the exam. Essentially what we're thinking is that it will be an essay. I'll talk about this more later because I was still on feedback, but just to know that this revised subject outline is in process and it's been sent off for approval before we can post it on Moodle. So I imagine that within the next day or so, it will be on Moodle, all being well. But sticking with feedback, just sticking with this feedback, Sabina, are you happy if I just talk to this a little bit? I just thought it might be useful if I thumbnail it, because later on I'm going to talk about it in more depth and, you know, talk about some of the theory of it. It's just been shown that feedback in relation to learning is like one of the most crucial things that you can do to promote learning is to provide feedback. So, I mean, it's fairly common sense. If somebody is learning how to tie a knot and they're doing it wrong, they need some feedback from the teacher. If somebody is learning a theory session and they need to know concepts, they need to know if the use of their concepts is accurate. Is that correct? So it's fairly obvious, but there's been a whole lot of learning, a whole lot of theory that's been studies that have been done on the importance of feedback and assessment, feedback and learning, when it should be, how quickly should the feedback be given in order to promote learning. Lots of things like that have been done, which I can cover later. But what I do want you to know is some of the practical implications of how to give feedback for your sessions, and the theory can come later. So it's important that when you're giving feedback that you start with some sort of assessment as to what's been done. So if I were to provide feedback on, say, this class, this lecture, you would run through what has been done. There were, 5 or 6 modules that discussed X, Y, and Z. The presentation was done by Chris with support from Sabina. And you just run through that. This is what you did. This is what was done. And then you talk about, usually what you would talk about is what was done well. Okay? And the psychology of that is that you need people to take on the feedback. People need to be open to suggestion, and that you're suggesting how people can learn rather than criticizing the person that delivered the session. So we don't want to be giving personal comments to the person that highlights them initially at all. We want to be supporting and saying, this is what you've done. This point was really good. I found this useful, and using that sort of language. So that then when there are areas that you might think that need more work, you have laid some groundwork of connecting with the person that's doing the presentation. Yeah, so that's really important. Then in terms of giving correction, you might make them as suggestions rather than criticisms. So your language needs to be suggestive. Have you considered? Would it be possible? In your approach, you said this. Is it possible that? Have you thought of an alternate way of doing that? So what you're doing is affirming and then extending on top of what they've given. So you're actually trying to engage, and your question is pejorative in the sense that, not pejorative, rather, it's not criticism, it's not putting down, it's open. There's an openness to your questioning. That's really, really important. So the mode of feedback is as important as the content of the feedback. The psychology of it is really important. Yeah, because people can become defensive, or they can become crushed, or they can become angry if feedback is given inappropriately. And I could tell you examples of where, particularly because it can be a power relationship, people are feeling vulnerable, they can feel judged, that it can be very damaging to give critical theory, particularly as a teacher. If you have a position as a teacher to vulnerable students and you give it badly, it can be actually quite damaging. And I've seen on many occasions senior professors who are very, very powerful because of their knowledge be very critical of more junior PhD students, and the person going to pieces because of that feedback. So we don't want that. You don't want ever to do that. So yeah, there's a little bit of a formula. Start with what was done, talk about the positive, accentuate the positive, the things that you liked, and then talk about, so you're giving some affirmative things, and then maybe 1 or 2 things or a few things that you think either didn't work or could be improved to work better. Anything you wanted to add, Sabine?
So yeah, I can bring it, there are probably 2 points. I can bring it back first to the assessment. So on your original subject outline, we had multiple times that you would submit. We've made it 2. One is a draft one. So you show us what you think would be a good feedback thing, and then one is your final one, because you learn every semester. And the other thing, I think it's really important, that's another skill in this subject. If you get the skill of giving feedback to people, and even supervisors, and that it's really beneficial, because everyone basically needs feedback and they can always do better. So yeah.
Yep.
Any questions on that?
I think with feedback, I think in my life, the more direct and clear the feedback, the better. When people are trying to be nice and they beat around the bush and they and and it's just, yeah, definitely so.
Yep.
Just a question with when that'll be allocated. So we'll cover all of this next week in our allotted tutorial times. So we'll go through who we are providing feedback to and for. Besides the first draft example feedback, which will just be for you guys as an example. Is that correct?
Yes, that's how I'm seeing it. Yep. It will be initially we'll go through what's expected very clearly in the tutorial session. We'll talk about who it is that when you will need to give feedback, and a little bit more on how, because there's a lot of people. I'm not sure that the students that are not listening to the class will have listened to it, and it's really important that they understand that about that for this assessment. Yeah, so we will. That's
awesome. Thanks for that.
Any other questions?
Elizabeth is asking, do you recommend using statements such as "I feel"?
I think you could use that. You could use "I feel." I think it's better off if you wanted to. That's for so I feel is effective. I'm not sure if you want to give an affective response so much in feedback as you might want to, but you might want to give more of a response about what happened for you in terms of your learning, or in terms of the understandability. If you did or didn't understand, or if you found what was done useful. I'm not sure "I feel" is a great way of doing it. You might say "I really liked," or "I struggled with," or I was challenged by. I'm not sure. I can't think of a sense where I'd use "I feel." Yeah. So hang on. So I feel. So saying the way I interpreted it was. Yeah, that's really good. That's good, Michelle. The way I interpreted it was, or what you said was, and what you described was, and I interpreted that as something like that. And so they can correct that. They then can come back with that.
So yeah, they're really useful, and we'll unpack that in different forms. So lecture and some material that you can read in your own time. But yeah, very good. Okay, we're good, Chris?
Yes.
Cool, wrapping up.
Okay, so in this the session, I'm not sure if anybody has any questions, but we've covered today surface and deep learning. We talked about the difference between those two, and really a lot of that can be done by looking at Bloom's taxonomy, which we also discussed. Remember, that's an excellent source for getting learning verbs when you do your specific purpose statement and writing your learning outcomes. So it was surface and deep learning, and then we looked at learning styles, and that there are different learning styles, and making sure that we have different learning styles that link with the learning outcomes. And then we unpacked constructive alignment and the importance of starting with learning outcomes, and making sure that your session is aligned with those learning outcomes, both in terms of content and in terms of the evaluation or assessment. And then we looked at the skill session and the theory session, and there are different models and different plans for the skill session and theory session that you should now be familiar with. Then Sabina looked at the different approaches to digital approaches to learning, from online to flipped to blended. And then we just finished a little bit with some feedback. So if anybody has any questions about anything that we've covered, let me know. And then once we've covered that, we'll just talk a little bit about assessment 2. Any questions on the content? Okay, so the response seems to be no. So in terms of the assessment 2, as I said, we're in the process of redoing the subject outline. It will be very substantially the same as what it was. So we're saying that the only major assessment change will be that the assessment 4, which was an exam, which was a 3-hour timed exam, is going to, we're proposing, and I assume it will be approved, that it will again be an essay, or sorry, a report. Now, my apologies, that's not ideal, it's not what I would want, but there are constraints on what sorts of things can be used for exams. So we're being told that we can't do exams, can't use exams that require everybody to do it at the same time. We can't use exams using Moodle, so that restricts us to how we can do things asynchronously. And we have struggled to find things that we could do effectively. So essentially what we're thinking of is that there will be a report, and it will be incorporate some of the things that you've already learnt. So it will be a little bit reflective, but I'll hold fire on giving you too much detail until I get the approval back from that. So that's the major change in your subject outline. In the assessment 2, it will largely remain the same, except that the tutorial design will actually be changed. You will all still join the tutorial, and then once you come into the tutorial, you might come in at different times. So we're thinking of splitting the tutorial into 2, so that we'll have groups of about 10 or 15 instead of one group of 30, and that you will present to half the class rather than presenting to the whole tutorial. So we'll again have details of this in the subject outline. You will still be required to do a session of the same, around about the same time. You will still be required to provide if you're using PowerPoint slides, you'll need to provide the PowerPoint slides. You'll need to provide a handout so that people can print it out. It can be electronic, of course. People can print it out, and you will need to provide a session plan of how your session works, okay, including the learning outcomes and the structure of it.
Are there recommended ways, or will there be recommended ways in the subject outline or otherwise, how we will hand those out or provide PowerPoint slides, handouts, things like that?
Yeah, we'll come up with that for next week. Who was that?
That was me, Jacob.
Jacob. Yeah, we'll come up with that for next week, Jacob. We'll have that clear by next week.
It also ties a little bit in, Jacob, with the material covered. Like, we'll set it up in terms of logistics, how you can contact your peers that you're presenting to, and one of us, but also depending on what you present, you're either going to present, give material to your peers prior or during the session. So that's in line with the flipped material and blended material.
Yeah, makes sense.
But all of the percentage, the style of assessments will remain the same. So assessment 2 and assessment 3 are exactly the same in that assessment 2, you'll be required to do the presentation, the simulation. Assessment 3, you'll be required to do an evaluation of other people's. The only one that will change is assessment 4. That will be from a synchronous, that is everybody sitting in a room exam, to a report that you'll get the topic in maybe, week 12 or 13, and it will be due either in the study, what was the study period or the exam period, once the university releases those dates. The university hasn't even released those dates yet. So we will have more on that as we go.
And that's still expected to be weighted 40%?
It is. So the weighting will remain the same at 40%.
with assessment 2, what happens if 2 people in the same day want to present the same skill?
That's entirely fine. It's entirely fine. And I had that last year, and they ended up being different. So it was similar. They were similar, but it didn't make any difference, and they were both fine and both did well.
Okay.
I got a question. Could we use props as well? Props?
Yep. What sort of props are you thinking of?
A guitar?
Yep.
That'd be fine.
Yeah, sure.
Sounds lovely. I hope we don't all have to play guitar, but the prop sounds really good.
I could get mine out, but it might be very bad.
I was thinking of doing like a 12-bar blues, like teaching a 12-bar blues or something like that, you know.
That might be hard though, because we won't have a guitar.
I could show them like pictures of the guitar and like the chords they have to do it, you know. And I thought of like maybe that. Like, I didn't want to tell anyone because I thought it would have been lame, but it's all good.
Yeah.
Might be on the right track. I just think about how you want to do it.
Yeah. I've got some ideas.
Happy to talk about that later.
Yeah.
Any other comments or thoughts? Questions before we finish?
There will be a link for our tutorials on Moodle, right? To connect similar to this, but for specifically our time.
Sabina?
Yeah, there will be, and there will be very explicit instructions of how it would work. IT is a little bit swamped, and I just want to make sure that the IT works 100% for your tutorials before I release anything. But it will be very clear, like what time you'll be and what you need to click on. It will be very similar to you being in this room. You know, certain time, certain place, click and join a meeting.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, in the absence of any more questions, I think we can finish up. Sabina, do you need to say anything else?
No, all good.
Okay, well, thanks again, everyone. I'm not sure if these sessions are working for you, but it seems like they are. So, yeah, great. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week and tutorials. So it's all going to get even more interesting. Can't
Yes.
wait. Okay. Cheers, everyone.
See ya.
See you. Bye.
So yeah, thanks.